Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
Where we discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hey, Curt.
Pep, it's great to see you again this morning. Man, after last week, we were set to record, and my goodness.
Yeah, it's been a crazy week here. You know, the beast had crossed the threshold. We had COVID in the house. Both my daughter and my son tested positive. And Hope is now out of quarantine and back at her school and doing all those things. And Coleman has one last day where he's locked up in his room. And, you know, it's just been crazy because, you know, in addition to, you know, I work from home, and in addition to working from home, my wife got sick too. So I became the food and beverage director here in the house. And in between meetings on Zoom, I'm running and preparing and running them up the stairs and trying to keep everything going. And I just feel like I need a moment to just sort of breathe this morning. You know, even before this call today, you know, we're recording this podcast. You know, we started about 10 o'clock this morning, and I've already had several meetings this morning. I've had kids to drive to school. I've had all the things like we all do. There's just everything just seems so chopped up and compartmentalized. And when I get here, it's like, okay, I want to focus. But I've, you know, and then having, you know, in the course of all this, working at home and having to learn new technologies on the daily, you know, that are people needing things urgently, and I don't, and I don't know how to get it to them.
Right. And, I mean, at our age, urgent is like something that we go to, right? We go to the urgent care center.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a thing that we're necessarily able to be. We're not able to be like flexibly adapt. No, we just go there.
I think it's good for me to be having to do those things, but in the moment, it doesn't feel like it's good for me at all.
Right.
So it's just been a morning already, and I'm excited about today. You know, this week I've been I was thinking about the whole integration thing that we introduced last week, and we're going to be beginning our talking about the 9 domains of integration today. I was driving around town. I have this great old Jeep Wrangler. I love it. It's like a 2002. It's got fairly low miles on it. It's my everyday driver. It's kind of a beast. It's kind of rugged. It's a 5-speed manual transmission. Exactly. It's my personality.
5-speed manual transmission.
Right. And a big beast of an engine under the hood, you know.
Pepper, the Wrangler Sweeney.
That's right. So I'm driving around town, and I'm thinking about, you know, integration. I'm thinking about what we're going to be talking about today, thinking about consciousness, and my rearview mirror falls off the window because the Jeep's rumbling. It falls off the window.
Like that.
Right. Just like that. And so for a moment, I was actually kind of happy about this because the biggest pet peeve to me is when somebody's tailgating me. I just can't stand it. Well, right now it's like, I can't even tell if there's anybody back there. So ignorance is bliss in a way. But I'm realizing, look, I'm conscious of what's in front of me. I'm conscious of what's on the sides of me, but I have no idea right now what's going on behind me. And it's kind of a dangerous situation, right? Yeah. You know, to not be fully conscious of all of my environments, especially when I'm, you know, hurling down the road at high speeds. Right. You want to be able to be aware. Right. And I was just thinking about, you know, how does this tie into the domain of integration that we're going to be talking about today, which is consciousness.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's such a great story, Pepper, because I think that there are so many things that you just highlighted that are true for our everyday life. I mean, how many times have any of us found ourselves, first of all, being relieved in our not having to pay attention to things that can be anxiety provoking for us.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. I mean, how many times do I actually try to rip off my rear view mirror as a way to not have to look at my past as a way to not have to look at the things that are in my rearview mirror. Sometimes it doesn't just happen accidentally, it happens quite on purpose. And I see that look on your face. Do you have a thought?
No, of course not. I'm a blank slate, buddy. No, I'm just in agreement. I mean, it's like, there are times where we just, like I said, ignorance is bliss, and we just want to pretend like it's not there.
Right.
That 18-wheeler that's barreling down on the back of us, and it feels better just to not know it's there, because if I look at it, it's anxiety producing and anger producing, and why is he trying to intimidate me, and all those kind of things. So
yeah. So we have introduced this notion today, and for our listeners, you all are listening to this notion of consciousness. That we like to talk about this notion of integration, which we introduced last week. I have to correct what I'd said. I'd mentioned, we'd even invited our audience to listen to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony.
Yes.
And I went back and listened to that, and then discovered it was actually his Ninth Symphony that I was thinking about and referring to. The Ninth Symphony being the one that his big choral arrangement, from which we have great hymns and so forth. But the Seventh Symphony also considered to be one of his masterpieces, as if any of them weren't. But I think about this notion of integration, and how we talk about a symphony orchestra. We talk about this idea of differentiated parts that our mind senses and images and feels and thinks. And we have these differentiated domains. And we need to have a conductor for this orchestra. We need to have someone that all of the different parts can look to. And so we talk about the prefrontal cortex as being the place in the human mind where these things come together. And pursuant to the name of this podcast, Being Known, we all out there, we all long to be known in order for integration to take place. It is in that process of being known, by being seen by the other. And the first thing that has to happen in order for that to take place is we actually have to be conscious. We have to be aware of what is happening in our world in order for those things to be integrated. If I'm the conductor, I have to be aware that I do have different parts of the orchestra that I have to pay attention to, let alone that I'm going to bring them together. And so one of the things that we talk about in neuroscience is this question of consciousness. Like, what does it mean to be conscious, and what is consciousness from a scientific standpoint? And there are a couple of really elegant ideas that are out there making their way through the neuroscientific community at this point. But even with them, we don't really know what consciousness is. We haven't been able to find the blueprint of that. We haven't been able to crack the code that tells us what does it mean to be conscious as a human? How is being human actually ultimately different than being a higher primate, let alone being a squirrel? How is that going to be? What does it mean for us to be aware in the way that we really are aware? Like, I don't just think, I'm able to reflect on what I'm thinking about. And so we have this capacity to be conscious of so many different parts of our lives. And yet it is those parts of our lives, what we sense and image and feel and think, that create experiences within us. Some are more pleasing and some are more displeasing and disintegrating and disruptive. And a lot of those I don't want to pay attention to. I don't want to pay attention to them because they create challenges for us. We'll talk later about how we tell stories in the narrative domain, and how the way that I tell a story often excludes certain parts of my mind's activity, certain parts of my story, certain parts of my history, because they're too painful for me to incorporate. And when I exclude them, when I don't pay attention to them, my brain is going to have to then burn energy to contain the disintegrated felt sense of what that is. And that energy that the brain has to burn to contain those things I'm going to keep out of my awareness is not going to be available to me to create the beauty and goodness in the world that God is calling us to create, because it's being siphoned off to manage all this other stuff that I'm having to manage. We like to talk about these three words that all begin with the letter A when we explore what it means to be conscious. The first is, am I awake in the world? Am I awake? Now, of course, I don't just mean, did I get out of bed when my alarm went off this morning? I mean, am I fully awake to what's happening, both in my world, outside of my skin, and inside of my mind? Am I awake to those things? And the second thing is, am I alert to it? Right? We have plenty of times when we know that we're awake, but we got to get our coffee before we do anything else, right? I got to get my coffee before I move from being awake to being alert. And there's this kind of like this phase in of being awake, and then I'm alert, and then I want to be attuned. So in relationships, we talk about, we might be, conscious we're in the room. I'm awake, but am I alert to what's happening, not just within me, but within you, within my wife, within my kids, within my friends, my neighbors, within my enemies? Are we actually alert to those things? Are we tuning in? And then are we attuned? And by attunement, I don't just mean, have I tuned in the way that I tune in my radio station? I do want to tune in, but I want to tune in order to really hear clearly. I want to understand. I want to feel what you feel. I want to understand what you understand. I want to know what it's like for you to be in your shoes. I want to not just be awake and be in the room with you. I don't just want to be aware that you are in the room. I don't just want to be awake and I'm aware that I'm in the room. I want to be alert to the notion that you're in the room. And then I also want to be attuned to what's actually going on with you and within me, and how we are interacting with each other. And it's hard for us sometimes to be awake, let alone alert and attuned, because for many of us, our stories that we live with interrupt some of the flow of those things. And so as we move forward, we know that I can't talk about any of the other domains of my life if I'm not actually awake, alert, and attuned to them, including the reality that it's not just me who's in the world, that I'm constantly in this intersecting world of relationships, whether somebody's in the room with me or not. My father, who's been dead since I was 17, he and I are in relationship with each other, whether he's in the room or not. Like he's in the room.
Still in the room, yeah.
He is in the room.
Yeah.
My mom, she is in the room. This is true for so many of us. And the question then becomes, what are the things that I'm doing to help me maintain being awake, alert, and attuned as we're on the road to consciousness?
And that's a great question. What are the things, right? I mean, what are the things that we need to do to practice to be awake, alert, and attuned?
So we like to talk about this in the world of interpersonal neurobiology. My friend and colleague Dan Siegel likes to talk about this notion of the tripod of awareness. If I'm going to be fully aware, you all out there, you can think of it in these terms. If you imagine a movie camera that's shooting the film footage of your life, and if it was projecting up on the screen everything about your life that's both going on inside your mind and that you're encountering in your day-to-day activity, that camera would sit on a tripod, and that tripod has 3 legs. I suppose that's redundant. A tripod wouldn't have 4 legs. It only has 3 legs. Otherwise, we call it quad pod. Right? Exactly. Thank you for helping me with that. And then we'd have to come up with 4 words that all begin with the letter Q, I think. But instead, we're going to come up with 3 words, each that begin with the letter O, that stands for a leg of this tripod. And the first word is the word open. Are we able to be open to all the things that we are sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking, and behaving? And by being open, I'm not talking about simply being open to acting on all the things that we sense and image and feel. We're not just saying that all that comes into us is good. We're not tending to qualify it or morally judge it. We're just suggesting that we want to be open to all the things that are there. I don't want to necessarily initially and impulsively close myself off to my mind. If I'm a conductor of an orchestra, I need to be open to all that the instruments are bringing to me, even if what some of those instruments are bringing are mistakes. I want to hear that. I need to be open to that in order for me to correct it. I don't want to close myself off and pretend it's not there just because I don't like what I'm hearing, in order for me then to just go on with the symphony. Because then when we play this for the audience, like, there's going to be these other things going on. They're going to interfere with things. So I want to be open to what I'm sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking, and what my body's impulse wants to be. The second leg of this tripod, is that I then want to be observant. I sense something. I sense arousal. I sense anger. I sense joy. I sense fatigue. I sense a whole range of things. Am I able to observe it instead of judge it? We're so quick to condemn so many things. We are having this conversation in the context of asking the question, what does it mean to be known in the Christian worldview? What does it mean to be known in the biblical narrative? What does it mean to be known when we're looking at things from a Christian anthropology, from what it means to be human from that perspective? And we want to be able to observe things without first condemning them. And, I grew up in a house where, as I've said here perhaps before, where certain emotional states really just weren't permitted. We weren't going to be open, let alone observe being angry, right? Nobody was allowed to be angry at my dad. Now, it's not like, there was an open order put out for everybody.
Right.
Like, no APBs were issued for anybody who's angry at Lewis Thompson. But there was a sense in which we're not really allowed, like, we're not open to that. And so I didn't observe anger. We didn't, nobody said, well, you sound angry, let's talk about that. We just wasn't ever allowed. And so I could never observe it. Instead, it was judged immediately. If I'm angry, then there's something wrong with that, and I'm going to be in trouble if I express that. That's like, I don't want my anger to be something I look at in my rearview mirror. And so I don't want to look at that at all. And so I'll take the rearview mirror off. I'm glad when it falls off, because I'm going to ignore this. But of course, if I practice ignoring anger in my first 20 years of life, it means by the time I get married to a woman who's more than happy to tell me when she's angry, and I mean this because she was just more, open and adaptive than I was. She could just say when she was angry, like, this is like scaring the living daylights out of me. I'm 6'2" and I weigh 200 pounds, and I'm like afraid. Like, how does that work? Well, I wasn't able to be observant. But we want to be able to observe and be curious about those things that we sense and image and feel and think, the elements of our story that we want to understand better. And then the last part of this tripod is the word objective. And when we use the word objective, I want to be open, I want to be observant. And by objective, we don't mean as opposed to subjective. Objective, like in some, this is what science tells us, this is true and real. But objective meaning that the more open I am, and the more observant I am, the more I observe, the more of the object that I see. When I find myself open and observant to my irritability, for instance, I can begin to see that my irritability might have a lot more to do with what my longings are. It's not just about being irritable. It is about my longing for closeness, my longing to be connected. And that's a lot different than me just saying, I'm just pissed off. But I can't see the entire object of my story if I'm not first open and then observant to the fullness of where my irritability is coming from. And so, you all out who are listening, you're listening to this, and I'm wondering, where in your stories have you found it difficult to be open, let alone to observe, in order to be objective about the entire story that God wants us to be aware of, in order for all of it to be redeemed, so that fear and shame are transformed, and such that we then can tell a new story of beauty and goodness. Pepper, we tell people that we're working with that we understand, we see our life coming at us through the windshield. So your example today is just so spot on. We see our life coming at us through the windshield, but we only understand our life through the rear view mirror. I only understand my life by figuring it out after it's gone by me. But there are so many parts of my story that I sometimes really find too painful for me to be open to or observe or be objective about. And so we're kind of left stranded. And then eventually our symptoms find us, whether those symptoms,
right.
Yeah.
I think it's a rare person that wants to look in that mirror and see that sometimes until it's too late, sometimes until you're forced to, sometimes until, God just puts it right in front of you and says, hey, you have to be open, observant, and objective about what's happening right now, or I'm going to force you to. Right. It's not easy work to do.
Right.
Like it's, but I think in relationship, it's more palatable if I have somebody that I'm doing it with.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think about I think about other friendships I have. I think about our friendship. I again, we've referenced these conversations that you and I've had over the years, in which we've both revealed things to each other, in which it's felt vulnerable to do that. And in some respects, you become my rearview mirror. You become the mirror into which I look. And yet what I'm looking at, because I'm actually looking at something in my life with you, and I'm now not just looking at it in the privacy of my own mind, you're being with me as we look at it, and you're being present and compassionate, and at the same time being able to hold my feet to the fire, as it were, about things that I want to be different, that I long to be different. That goes a long way in transforming my story, because the mirror is actually present with me. And so you actually help me be more awake, alert, and attuned. You strengthen my not just capacity, but courage to be open, observant, and objective. And as such, more of my story is told in light of the presence and work of the Holy Spirit, because where two or more are gathered, there will I be also in your presence. Getting the sense that Jesus is always at work anytime you and I are talking to each other. We believe that even as we're having this podcast and our listeners, you all are listening to us and we're together in this, that the Holy Spirit is weaving our conversation together with your story, with our stories, in such a way that that tripod stands on firmer and firmer ground, even as we share with one another the things that we're talking about. One of the primary neurobiological functions that is involved in all this is what we, commonly call attention, our attentional mechanism. If I'm going to be open and observant and objective, I have to pay attention to what I'm paying attention to. That's one of the most important questions that we ask folks. We talk about the function of attention that, for the most part, most researchers would say really is housed primarily in the front right part of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And could you say that, just so that I know that you heard me say that?
The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Yes, thank you. And so I know that you all could get that. I'm just pleased that I was able to say it without tripping over my own tongue. That we ask the question, how well are you paying attention to what you're paying attention to? Because attention really is the ignition key to the engine of the mind. There's nothing that we do that is not a function of a shift in our attention. And what we pay attention to is what we then remember. We'll talk about memory in a few episodes. What we pay attention to, we remember, and what we remember becomes our anticipated future. And our anticipated future is constantly circling back into our present moment, shaping what we're doing in the here and now. And so I have parts of my story that I either do or don't pay attention to. Parts of my story that before you and I met, I told a certain way. After you and I've met, I'm telling a very different way that enables me to anticipate a future much more hopefully, because there's certain parts of my story where shame has lurked that it no longer does. And so this whole notion of changing our neural network circuitry, what we call neuroplasticity, is shaped primarily by how we direct our attention. With our attention, we say that we like to snag the brain. We like to stimulate neuronal activation and growth. We like to say if I want the renewal of my mind to take place, that's not just metaphor. This is about changing the direction and contour and firing patterns of my brain, and I want to snag those neurons. And so that acronym SNAG, S-N-A-G, I stimulate neuronal activation and growth, and that changes my brain structure while my mind is being renewed. And the thing is, we need other people. I need you to help me do this. I don't do this very efficiently or very well when I'm by myself. When I have other people in my life by whom I'm being known, their coming to find me enables me to pay attention to the things that I find hard to pay attention to. I have a tendency to avoid paying attention to the hard things about my story.
Sure.
And the more I don't pay attention to those things, the more likely I end up to be a person of addiction, because I'm going to use addictions to cope with all that stuff that I can't cope with. And therefore, it makes it really difficult ultimately for me to pay deep attention to what I really want and the beauty that is wrapped up in that. Instead, I get kind of short-circuited into these addiction kind of dead ends because I'm not able to pay attention, because I've either taken the rearview mirror off or it's fallen off and I'm not seeing what I want to see. I think as we think about wrapping up this episode, I think about some things that we can do to actually practice paying attention, how we can practice becoming more open, observant, and objective. One of those things is the practice of mindfulness meditation. There's a lovely book called Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird. It's a short book written by this gentleman. He's a Catholic gentleman. Oh, Pep's holding it up. It's a beautiful book. Wow. Yes. Right on cue. My word.
Mention another book. We'll see if I have it.
Okay. Yeah, Into the Silent Land. And one of the things that you learn about is that the meditative practice of silence, and he focuses on the 60-second psalm. For God alone my soul waits in silence. We hear this opening line from the psalmist, this notion that when I'm practicing silence in this way, I strengthen my capacity to be present with my mind's activity and become unafraid of all the different things that are banging around in my head. That's one exercise, the practice of mindfulness meditation, especially as we exercise meditation on scriptural passages, when we meditate on beauty, when we meditate on experiences that we've had with other people in which we feel deeply known. And throughout our time, we'll come back to some of the other exercises that we can do as far as being able to strengthen our attention's mechanism. I think with that, I'm just going to ask you if you've got other further thoughts, questions.
This whole idea that you introduced me to of just paying attention to what you're paying attention to as you go about your day has been really helpful to me. I think that there are a lot of times where, I would be spending time paying attention to stuff that isn't helpful to me, isn't, what I should be being awake, alert, and attuned to. And just that reminder of, going about my day and thinking, okay, what am I paying attention to? What are, what are the things that and what is actually happening here? What, has been something that's been, just a helpful practice for me. And I'm trying to add in the idea of silence. And I'm wondering if you have from Laird's book, um, the practice of if you could talk for a minute about the practice of the breathing and the prayer word. And, maybe we can encourage people to try this a couple of times this week. And if we just talk about that one practice, I think that could be good.
Right. And we can all do this at home. It's not hard to do. This is the beauty of what we like to call the beauty of the breath. This notion that our pulmonary function, our breathing, is the one thing about our bodies that is both automatic. We don't have to think about it. It does it on its own, but that we can also regulate quite easily and quite well. And the notion of breathing more deeply and breathing more slowly requires us to pay attention to that. And so the practice as it unfolds is you can simply find yourself in a quiet space and in a comfortable position, a comfortable posture, both feet on the ground. Allow yourself to be comfortable, often with your palms open, although for some folks that's not as comfortable, but find a comfortable position. Allow your eyes to close and take 2 long, deep cleansing breaths. And after those long, deep cleansing breaths come, you can begin to pay attention to your breath eventually. We actually take people through an exercise often in which we start with just enabling them to pay attention first to their body, their legs, their torso, and then even their chest wall as they're breathing. And then allowing their attention to focus on their breath itself, which is not easy to do because you can't see it. All you can do is kind of feel it a bit as it passes through your nostrils or maybe the back of your throat. But quietly, deeply breathing in and out. And we associate that, as Laird does, we associate that breathing in with a prayer word. And it can be a very short phrase, or it can be a word. So some folks will say, for instance, with the inhalation, we can in our mind say to ourselves, Lord Jesus Christ, for instance, and then on the exhale, have mercy on me. Some will even get it to the point where it's so short where it's just Lord Jesus as I inhale, help as I exhale. We'll find that when we do this, that my mind will start to want to go all over the place. I will be thinking about all kinds of things other than my breath and the prayer word. And the work involved, as Laird properly and helpfully instructs us, is that when we sense our mind wandering away from the prayer word and from our breath to all these other myriad of things that we have to do, that we're thinking about, that we're worrying about, that we allow without judgment to return our attention to our breath and to the prayer word. We use the prayer word as a bit of an anchor, as something that we know we can return to over and over and over again. It's often said that masters of this practice, you would think, oh, well, they just stay on the prayer word and they can meditate for 20 minutes to an hour without ever leaving. But what masters will tell you is that no, in fact, the more practiced you become at this, the more frequently you are aware of how often your mind leaves the prayer word, how distracted you are. With me, when I first started this, I would only notice that I, returned to the prayer word a couple times in 20 minutes. It's because it took me 15 minutes to discover that I was wandering off the path before I'd ever woke up to, oh, I'm not even paying attention to the fact that I'm not paying any attention anymore. This exercise, I think, serves a larger purpose as well, not just what it does in the moments that we're practicing it, but it then becomes like strengthening a muscle that you can use in other times in your day. When you find yourself, you become more acutely aware of when your attention is moving someplace else that you don't want it to be. And even at 2:00 in the afternoon, when you're in the middle of a meeting and you find yourself getting anxious about something, simply returning to your prayer word, taking 2 deep breaths, changes everything about how you are open, observant, and objective to that present moment. Being fully awake, fully alert and attuned, looking for God to be at work, creating beauty and goodness, even in moments when it feels like you're in the middle of a fight, when it feels like you're anxious or afraid, when it feels like you're about to do something in some addictive way that you really don't want to be doing. And so it is a way for us to practice getting ready to be attentive to the beauty that is about to unfold, that God wants us to co-labor with him to create.
So as a challenge for this week, it's hard when you start thinking about doing something like this and you think, okay, how much time can I really dedicate to sitting and doing this? So it would seem to me that like other things, the more times that we do it, the stronger we'll get and the more prepared we'll be to help in other aspects of our lives. So how should we challenge people this week to, the amount of time, the amount of frequency, and that kind of thing?
Right. I say, let's do it in a way that makes it easy for us to do, so we don't find that it's just like climbing Everest. So I tell people, when you begin this, literally try to do it for 60 seconds. See what it feels like for 60 seconds, and then maybe move to 3 minutes, and then maybe 5 minutes. Try this for 5 minutes once a day for the first week. And then maybe move it to 10 minutes once a day. Eventually, we like to have people extend this out so that this is the first thing that they're doing for maybe anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes in the morning and 10 to 20 minutes in the evening. And the more you practice this and become efficient at it, you will find yourself dropping into these spaces for 30 seconds at a time throughout your day, enabling this to have that tripod of awareness grounded, being aware of your being, as we say, in Christ, whose life is, we are hidden with Christ in God, sitting at his right hand, visualizing, imagining this, looking for the beauty that is to unfold before us. And we do this because we become more efficient at things when we practice things for a short period of time more frequently than for longer periods of time less frequently. So your admonition for that is really well taken.
Great. So I accept the challenge, and I will be doing this. And I just want to say that everybody just expect to feel uncomfortable with this in the beginning. It's a bit awkward if you've never done it before, but if we can stick to it and we get through it this week, then we just try it again next week, and I think the benefits we'll all reap. So thank you, Curt. Thanks for a great day. Really appreciated this conversation.
Thanks, Pep.
Just a reminder, everybody, that we are going through the 9 domains of integration throughout this first season. And today we had our first conversation about it. I thought it was great. Thanks, Curt. I love you, buddy.
Thanks, Pep. Love you too, man.
That was great. That rear view mirror story.
It just carries so much weight. Yes. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good.
And there were 2 things that stood out. So the rear view mirror thing, I thought, if you have a passenger, if you try to look in the rear view mirror of the driver, it's very hard. You have to, move your body over there, crane your neck to see. But even no matter what, if I can get a view in the rear view mirror, it is going to be different than the driver's.
Yeah.
And so, Curt, when you were talking about the retelling of the story, so 2 things. 1, the driver has to tell me what they see. If I want to know what their experience is, they have to tell me.
Yeah.
And then
that's great.
I have a different perspective because I can't have the same perspective as you do.
Right.
And so by sharing my perspective, then we can retell each other's story.
Yeah. Right on.
And then the whole idea that, like, if we tear the rearview mirror off, we tear the good also. We miss the beauty that we might see. So it's not like we have one rearview mirror for the bad things and another rearview mirror for the good things. It's like it's all there. And then the other thing that struck me was with the awake thing of being open, observe, and objective. I thought, am I open? Am I awake with other people? Because like the non-judgment, like observe without judgment, then I thought my best chance for being awake with others is to be awake with myself. So it was fabulous.
Right on. Thanks. Those are just really great highlights. I think that whole notion of having a different perspective, that really just is really helpful for me. About you have a different sight line. You're seeing different things, but you can't know what the driver sees until the driver tells you what the driver sees.
Right.
And that's helpful. And I also really appreciate that whole question, which we'll get when we talk about storytelling in more depth, that whole notion that, like, well, who am I helping? How am I being observant for others as well? How can I help, assist in that? Because I think we so underestimate our role in enabling others to be able to live into the life of integration. But we are, like, you are the light of the world, right? This sense that, like, you are an agent of integration. It's not a matter of, like, are you or aren't you? You are, and am I awake and attuned and alert to that reality? And I need others to help me wake up to that. So thanks to both of you, I'm more awake.
I just think about the driving analogy, how often I'm driving down the road with my wife in the passenger seat and I don't see something in my blind spot and start to pull over and I get a whoa, hon.
And she lets you know.
She lets me know.
Yeah. How many times have I heard? How many times have I heard brake lights, brake lights, brake lights? And the brake lights are, like, a mile and a half down the road. All right. But my wife sees them, and she knows who's behind the wheel, and she knows, like, this dude, he needs to hear brake lights long before he gets there.
Because there is a history there.
Oh, yes, exactly right. There is a trauma. There is a trauma where Curt doesn't, like, he believes in the brakes of his car, and he doesn't really need to apply them before 20 yards before the bumper's coming up at him from the car ahead of him.
Right.
I believe in those brakes.
That's great.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and music is by Keaton Simons. If you'd like to connect with us, you can visit us on our website, beingknownpodcast.com, or you can find us on social media at beingknownpod. Be well, be known.